You've discovered the Techno Progressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. This week on Techno Progressive Hub, L.A. Matteo and I are going to discuss the proposals for pro-worker artificial intelligence laws. Recently, David Autor, Darren Acemoglu, and Simon Johnson and the UK Trades Union Council have proposed a set of regulatory and legal reforms to protect workers from automation and to enhance human expertise. We're going to talk about whether they will only work briefly until AI takes all of the jobs. How do they stack up against Trump's proposed policies, other important questions about this as a techno-progressive topic. Ellie, what was your first impression when you saw these documents? And we have links in the show notes, by the way, for everybody.
Sure. So generally, I thought they were really helpful papers. I think taking a step back, as I talked about last time, and as we talk about as techno-progressives, we think that the left should be talking about these transformational technologies not as threats to be managed, but as opportunities to seize. So the question for me as I think about all of these things isn't whether AI is going to transform the economy and how exactly we manage that transformation when it comes to specific jobs. The questions are always, how do we set policy to make sure that the potential for these extraordinary gains in productivity, capability, prosperity ends up being broadly distributed, democratically operated, and not just captured by a few people and not just immiserating many other people. So to me, as I read these papers, that was one of the biggest tensions I saw. And we'll talk through some of the ways that we think that I think and we think that these papers have some great ideas. But one of the central tensions for me, especially in the Acemoglu paper, was that their central thesis was, how do we make sure that technology should expand human capabilities and make human expertise more valuable rather than simply automating tasks to commodify labor. I think that's a little limiting, or it can limit us in a lot of ways. I mean, if you look back in history and we think about this, when the electric streetlight came out, that effectively did automate the labor of street lamplighters. That was a good thing. We, of course, needed to make sure that the street lamplighters were taken care of and that they weren't simply thrown into poverty. But as a whole, that's a good thing. And you could think about a future, we're not there yet, but you could think about a future where AI is better drivers or AIs are better radiologists and they find cancer better. And yes, that would make the experience and expertise of human drivers and radiologists less valuable, but it would make everyone better off. And I think we on the left and Democrats and people who think about themselves as techno-progressives should think about, how do we talk about that? How do we affect policy that can manage that could do that properly and navigate both the short-term hardships and the long-term potential, great potential of for prosperity and abundance in ways that help everyone. So my big thing is I think about these policies, and this comes to tax policy and this comes to antitrust and IP, is, there's a way that we could think about this and talk about this that is broader than what this paper lays out. That, I found it telling that they spent a lot of time on tax reform, but to me, the central issue of tax reform is redistributing. It's not simply, tweaking. One of the examples that we'll talk about is treating labor the same way that capital is treated. And yeah, obviously, we should do that. If AI is doing the same work as a worker, it should be treated the same way in the tax code. But that's not as important in my mind as the massive redistribution that needs to happen if value from these AIs accrues to a small number of people and everyone else is contributing to it but doesn't get paid. So I'll stop there, but I think that we can, that's my central tension as I read this paper from the techno-progressive perspective.
Yeah, there's a bit of a flavor of let's tax the steam engine to subsidize the welfare system for buggy drivers or something like that. And it's like, yeah, we're for the welfare of buggy drivers, but I'm not sure that, slowing down the steam engine is the way to get there. Matteo, you had focused on the five key elements that they were promoting. What are those five?
The five elements that were in this report here, called Building a Pro-Worker AI Innovation Strategy, which was created in the UK to determine how the UK should address these issues that are facing a lot of workers there. I can raise up the 5 points.
Mhm.
The first one is innovation for good work. Well, they go into a lot of stuff, and we can really, I think, have a debate and discussion about what good work is and what it really means. Um, but in a broad sense, I agree. We don't want to create worse work, and there is some ways in which automation can do that and can push jobs toward actually more mundane tasks rather than toward higher end tasks. Two is returning public value to public services. Three is securing a digital dividend for workers and productive investment. Four is pro-worker AI regulation and upgrading rights. And five is supporting workers during change. And I think, I broadly agree with at least the spirit of all of these. And the one that I found most interesting here is the idea, which was also raised by Darren Asimoglu, which is that automation's not inevitable in the sense of it's not an inexorable trend that only goes one way. And if you listen to a lot of talks, especially by CEOs of AI companies like OpenAI and others, is that there's just this one trajectory that it's inexorable, it can't be changed. We're going 1,000 miles an hour on one track. And I think that one of the main things in these reports is that that's actually not true. That's a mythology that's created by these companies in order to argue that they can't be regulated and that they are the only people who can usher in the future and that there's nothing else anybody can say about it. And the reports don't really say, well, they're not really like part of the pause AI movement or anything like that, where they're really arguing against AI taking over the world or any kind of X risk type language. And they don't really even argue that it should be stopped or paused. And in some ways, they don't even argue that it should be slowed down, but more that the working class, which is the majority of the population in every country, it should have, and the workers whose labor is being automated through these processes, not only should they be part of the conversation because they're going to be affected by it, but because in some ways they can not only steer it so that it benefits workers socially and culturally, but that it can make for better automation. They make the point that there can be these futures in which automation does not dramatically improve productivity, which is a kind of a paradox. You would be replacing workers, but you don't get significantly more productivity. That seems kind of absurd. And Darren Asimoglu especially argues, well, a lot of that is because the people who are in charge of automation actually don't have any idea what workers do, and they only understand the fields that they're in. And so they're really good at automating certain parts of coding or certain tasks that are in the fields of the people who are doing the automation, certain engineering tasks, but they don't actually know a lot of, for instance, like what nurses do or what, a radiologist does, which is why there's a lot of errors. And it might be better like on net often, like maybe they'll make less mistakes, but there's always then the risk if you're still making a lot of mistakes and you're creating synthetic data from those mistakes that you could have these cascading failures eventually because you're going to be training new models on flawed data, which is harder to fix if you're not in constant conversation with the people in those fields to give a lot of feedback. And I think that for me was a really important point because we want to make sure that when we're building intelligent systems or systems that are going to be used to improve the process, that it actually improves the process and that it does so on the most optimized footing and not and it doesn't continuously miss things because there's not enough feedback from the system itself, from the workers who are part of that system. And I think that's the large takeaway. And that TUC report was arguing that we need to have a formal role for unions, for workers in different sectors to come to this and be like, well, maybe that's not actually what we're doing. Like that's not, you're automating for the wrong things.
Yeah,
You know,
the TUC is promoting a kind of Swedish co-management model. where a third of the board of directors would be appointed by trade unions, which, I ran some of these proposals past my trade union organizer's son, and he said, well, if we had the power to do that, we wouldn't have a problem in the United States, a lot of the proposals that both Acemoglu and Atur make and that the TUC makes is predicated on the idea of a powerful trade union movement. And if we had a powerful trade union movement, we'd be having a different conversation. But I want to go back to something you said, Matteo, about the inevitability question, because I think this is a key aspect of the kind of techno-progressive perspective as we're trying to flesh it out. It's like there are some people who say we're being sold an inevitabilist discourse or inevitabilist line by the capitalists that say we have to have AI. And are we the people who say, no, we could reject AI, or are we the people? And because actually, I'm linking to an article about Atur and Acemoglu from the New Yorker called "Can We Have Pro-Worker AI?" And here it talks about their book "Power and Progress: Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity," where they look at all the previous political economies of technological innovation. And one of the conclusions that they have is you can't stop technological change, but you can shape it. So I think this is like key for techno-progressives, right? That we believe that you can shape it. We should shape it. That's the whole point, is to shape it. But what are the things that we think are inevitable? And obviously we differ about which things are inevitable from what other people think is inevitable.
The other thing I would add to that too, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, James and Matteo as well, is I think that one thing that techno progressives do that is different, and I think adds value, is we also take a harder look at the other side of the ledger, of the positive side. It's not just that it's what the question isn't whether it's inevitable or it's not inevitable, whether it could be shaped or it could not be shaped. The question is, is also what benefits can it bring? What are the things that technology can do to increase human flourishing, not just flourishing between the hours of 9 and 5, not just making jobs better, but human flourishing and human freedom and human dignity. And that's something that I think that our perspective informs the left by saying, let's not just look at how AI is hurting jobs, or Matteo, and something you were saying that I think is an interesting tension that I read in the paper that you and I may disagree about, is that I think that the left is sometimes weakest when it tries to tell technologists how to make their technology better. Like, not that it is the case that they are wrong, that having more input from workers could improve the technology, but to me that just doesn't seem like a very important question, or it seems like a question that could work itself out in other ways beyond public policy. I think as I think about this, I think what should we do from the public policy perspective. To me, it always seemed like you've seen this over the course of AI, where they said AI, it'll never beat a chess champion, or there's too many things, too many, and then it gets into the papers recently, the stochastic parrot paper, where like, they rested their critique on the fact that AI just wasn't very good at generating language. And I think the more the technologies advance, the more they overtake these questions. And if you think of a hypothetical, what if there is an AI nanny, and it would be very hard, and I don't know if it's going to come, but if it comes with an AI nanny that does a really good job and is better than a human caretaker, then the question of is those questions have been overtaken, and we need to think about the next questions of what does that do for the millions of people who are caretakers, who make their living that way, who derive their meaning from that. How do we do that? How do we make sure that that's equitably distributed, so it's not just the wealthiest people who can get the best childcare support and can pursue other opportunities, and questions of those nature. So again, I think that those were, to me, struck me as the weakest points, where they tried to critique the technologists and putting workers. Yeah, of course, workers should be involved, people should be involved, but not. I don't think for the reasons that they lay out exactly.
Hmm.
Well, yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think that in some ways, if we're only thinking of workers in the very narrow sense of like a worker has a particular trade and they do that trade, and so they're an expert in that trade, um, which is true of some workers, but actually not of most workers. Most workers are not experts. They're good at a few tasks that are specific to a company's process, um, which is a critique of all of capitalism, right? Like, I mean, going back to like the dividing up and division of labor. And you you have there was a paper, there was the book, Labor and Monopoly Capital, where Braverman's talking about like, okay, you can make a lot of pins or a lot of nails by dividing up the process of pin making and nail making. But, you have to divide up the person because labor occurs through people. And so, it's not that we shouldn't have nails and we shouldn't have pins, but in how much should we divide up the process in benefit of, and how much does that benefit the process of making these things versus how much does it benefit the people who are in charge of making these things? And this is a kind of nuanced distinction in a lot of ways, but it's something that's not often, risen in these conversations is that um, they talk about it, and James was right too. They talk about, well, workers own this expertise, right? And they, you know, for and clearly, like for hundreds of years, thousands of years, there have been carpenters, and so that trade of doing carpentry and the different advancements in tool making that has affected carpentry has really been carried on by carpenters. And then if you create a program that can automate carpenters, you're kind of extracting that several thousand year process, right? And on the one hand, that's true, right? Like, does this process improve carpentry, or is it because the companies that, on the other hand, it's does the companies do the companies that build houses and other things with carpentry, is it really only to benefit them and sometimes at the expense of the process? And so I think that's really where I was looking at it as thinking like if it's only to narrowly, look at the worker, say in the past you would have said a farm worker, and when you have a combine, you're eliminating the people who harvest, and you have automatic seeding and other things, and you don't have people with bags like spreading seeds. Okay, we can understand that it hurts, those certain individual people for like one generation or two generations, and then they find other work. Okay. But we know that
And
it
fewer
is,
people lose their limbs in seed threshers or whatever they are.
yeah,
Which
but
is
it's like,
which is to Ellie's point about the looking at the benefits. I totally agree that one of the techno progressive things is that we have to look at the potential benefits. And it reminds me of the Tokugawa regime is often offered as an example of people who just said no for 400 years to technology, and look where it got them, right? The Admiral Perry's ships turned up, and they didn't know what to do about it, and all of a sudden they had to play catch up to modernity. But for 400 years, they said no to technology. So you could read it both ways, right? That
when they had a lot of expertise, right, in Japanese society. There
they
were a lot
built
of
they,
very skilled tradespeople, right?
they built one of the more pleasant, societies in the entire world. And I'm a big fan of Japan, and I think it's partly because they were isolated. And so I don't know. I can see both sides, but if you don't put on the table that all the things that they forewent, the advances in modern medicine, the electrification, all the things that were happening in the West that they eventually caught up with. Well, I guess not electrification by the middle of the 19th century, but the other things. So I think that is part of it. But let's go through some of the other proposals. One of the things that they proposed in there is rebalancing the tax code. That's a big centerpiece of Auteur and Acemoglu's perspective. And it seems like a no-brainer that if we have a tax code that gives tax benefits for capital expenditures like AI agent investments, and does not give tax benefits for hiring workers, that if we flip that around, that'd be good, at least in the short term, for workers.
I have sympathies with everybody who loses their livelihood, and as I don't want to lose my own livelihood. Obviously, nobody does, right? That's the whole point. And nobody's gonna like be for something. They might be for it in theory, and then when it's their own livelihood and their own community and people, of course, they're not for it. Just like the Weavers and the Luddite, in the Luddite uprisings. And I am not, I don't, I have sympathy for the people who lost their their livelihoods in that way. And of course, to them is unfair because there was no other way for them to be. There was no system set up that could, really ethically deal with this problem.
No
And many
OSHA,
of them
no
were thrown into
unemployment
poverty.
insurance, no Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, so they went into many times they had to work jobs where they got paid a lot less in much worse conditions, and sometimes they were thrown into poverty or starvation or whatever. And that has happened in every transitional period, and it's going to happen again, most likely. And I think the things that it's not that I don't agree with those kind of romantic views of certain crafts and the guilds and there are many books for a long period of time that are like, we should go back to the Middle Ages because everybody was in a guild and there were knights and everybody knew where they stood and there was all this meaning in life and okay, not to get into whole Middle Ages about why that wasn't that great, but I think that does speak to, Ellie's point about like, yeah, we don't want to just defend, we want to defend the individual people who are affected by moving to street lamps, but lamp lighting was a grueling job, a horrible job that was often done by kids. And, you know, if we had a way if we had a society that could actually support, and we do, we have physically and, in terms of the economics, we have the ability to be like, no, kids don't have to work lamp lighting. And in our case, right, kids don't have to work in cobalt mines. Like that's happening too. They're the lamp lighters of our time.
Right.
And
We
they
already
don't work back.
restrict, to your point, we already say kids can't work until a certain age, and you can't work below a certain wage, at least theoretically. And that means that there are certain kinds of jobs that just aren't done by humans because you can't afford to hire a human at minimum wage to do it. And we already accept that. So why wouldn't we be want to say then human beings shouldn't do lamplighting or whatever dangerous thing that could be robotized?
Yeah, but then if you gave a tax break and you said, hey, any company that employs lamplighters, they're going to get a tax break, and the company that puts in the electric lights is not going to
Right.
get a tax break.
And that's the problem with this
Regress,
tax policy
right?
proposal. Yeah.
I think that to agree with Ellie, I think that would be a regressive thing.
Although
And
I although I would say, just to put a finer point, I actually found their tax proposal pretty reasonable. That, I found it, if, like I said in the beginning, if it is the case that AI is doing the same as a human laborer, it seems arbitrary and creates the wrong incentives to allow corporations to, to get taxed more favorably on their capital expenditures or depreciate their computers, but not get tax benefits by, quote unquote, depreciating their labor costs. So that seemed like a reasonable proposal, at least in the short term. I thought one thing that I thought was interesting in the New Yorker piece that we'll link to, Cassidy asks Autor at the end about UBI and, larger redistributive and policies that would put more money into people's pockets. And Autor, he responds positively to that, but that was almost an afterthought in the New Yorker piece, and it was non-existent. And I know that wasn't the focus of their piece, but to me, as I said before, when I think about tax policies, I think, think bigger than just making labor the same as capital when it comes to depreciation or other tax benefits. Let's think about, how we take, redistribute or take money that some of these big tech companies have gotten, as Matteo and James both mentioned, from the labor and thoughts of other people, that belong to the commons. So just putting on my communications hat, I think that one way I think about this is, as I read some of these policies, was to some of these policies can work very well, but we may benefit from reframing them in ways like intellectual property is not a pro worker issue, it's a commons issue. It's this is something that was created by, through the work, labor, ideas of all people, and shouldn't just the benefits of which shouldn't just accrue to a few people. That's different than talking about it as people in specific jobs who do this, because it's not the case that any individual carpenter also benefits from the work that thousands of people have done, millions of people have done, and generations have done before him or her. It's a commons issue. It's that person should be able to benefit from it, and so should other people. And I see it the same way here.
That's
Oh
an
yeah.
excellent transitional point because then one of the other things that they talk about is IP, intellectual property protections for workers, giving workers more ownership over their own work, which is a natural extension of the debate we're having about creative rights and artists' work being sucked up by these things, which I just confess I've already been on the side that you're describing, Ellie, which is that I think it's intellectual property overreach to say that if I could look at their work online for free and learn how to do something from that work and then do that, it wouldn't be considered intellectual property theft. It'd be considered, that was the whole point, was for me to look at your work and learn something from it, do something with it. And that's what the AI did. So why is there a problem? But on the other hand, they also try to apply that to the worker having skills in the job that is going to be stolen by the AI looking over their shoulder. And I think that's even more problematic because what does it mean? Like for me as a sociologist, my survey making ability is going to be stolen by an AI and I'm going to be mad about that and sue it for, intellectual property theft.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree that it's a little bit absurd. And I think that's like, the classic Marxist point is that, we can't really I like the kind of spirit of that sentiment, like, a carpenter, a teacher, a sociologist, a lobbyist, whatever. Anybody who does work, has built up skills and they're part of a profession and though and so we kind of have a certain ownership over it. But and we don't want to just be dispossessed of it and for free, basically for very little money, and then we're not able to make a living and we have to go work for, $7 an hour. But on the other hand, the basic Marxist point is that, we're all part of a social labor system, and there cannot be any specific branch of labor that is separate from other branches, right? So as Ellie said, you don't have carpenters without you're not going to build a house with just carpenters. You need to have roofers and plumbers and electricians and people who excavate it and all these different jobs. And those people need truck drivers to get the materials there and trains and all this stuff, right? It's all part of one system. So in that sense, it's not, and including the labor that is used to develop the automation, right? It's also part of the system. And so when we're thinking about the division of labor, the thing that is most important to me is the division between the people who are actually doing the work, and then you have a certain divorced management, and where automation benefits management's ability to control the labor process, especially at the expense of the process, sometimes making it not less efficient, which when I was bringing up Braverman, he pointed out that you can have automation that actually does not make the process more efficient. It just makes it more controllable. And that I think is and Asamoglu brings up something similar, that's a very negative form of automation that should not be, um, you know, um, encouraged, right? We should be optimizing for the things that bring about, and I think this is what they mean by better work, or the spirit of that sentiment is that we want to bring about things that are not yet possible, right? We want automation to free up the labor that is necessary in the system, things that have not yet been automated or have not yet been thought about to be automated even. Right? I don't think that we have yet, some people believe that we're at the end of all possible human jobs, but I think there's still a lot of things that we haven't even invented yet. And so we should really be focusing on getting there and pushing that forward, the edge forward in ways that, lead to more human flourishing and advance new fields and larger projects. I think like even in the existing projects we have, like we could be doing a lot more very large engineering projects that are very beneficial and global projects. And there's all these things we need to do that are very expensive. Like right now in space, that could be used like I know, Ellie, you know a lot about geoengineering, right? Like these kinds of things are extremely expensive with regular human labor. But if automation makes labor a little cheaper in some areas, maybe the labor that goes into building really successful geoengineering could be freed up. We could actually do new stuff.
Yeah, if we need to plant a bunch of trees or build carbon scrubbers to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. That robots are going to help a lot with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bringing it back to the IP policies that they lay out. One thing that this brought to mind when I read it is something I know, James, you've worked and you've thought a lot about is, how when you look back at the history of technology and policy, so much of policy at any given moment is contingent on the limitations of the technology at that moment. That the music business existed and was able to operate because LPs were not very easy to copy. And then once they became on cassettes, so then digitized, it became much easier to copy. The policies had to change, the business models had to change. And you see that now with surveillance, how nobody objects when you walk down the street and you look at someone, but all of a sudden when computers are and cameras are much better at looking at people and storing information than humans are, that becomes a problem, and we need to think about it in different ways. And I see the IP issue as the same, that it's the technology has scaled up, the technology has gotten better, and that means that the way that we've thought about these policies has to change. And I think that the kind of the neo-Luddite perspective on this is always going to be that means the technology is the problem, and that means we need to stop the technology. And I think the way we're thinking about this is a more productive way, that it's not that we need to stop the technologies, because we can look at the benefits that things like digital music and cameras and computers that have massive memories and never forget have for people, but also accept that we need to not just let it rip and say who cares the impact on people, and who cares what artists are losing their jobs, or what's being faked and who's being hurt, but how we can shape policy to maximize the benefits while also protecting people and making sure that those benefits are shared.
I'm fine with this concept of intellectual property strengthening insofar as I think a law that said that people could opt out should be adopted. That you, just as we had with search engines, we had the convention of putting robot text in your HTML folder, your directory. And when the search engine hit that robot text, it would say, you can read these ones, but don't read these ones. And that's more or less worked, although I'm sure there are deep web archives of everything. But so I think I'm fine with that. But it does remind me that this week a paper came out that was asking a bunch of LLMs to do political recommendations, and they were applying it in Japan. And it turned out that if you had any left-wing idea in Japan, you were recommended to vote for the Communist Party, even though there were other parties who had those same policies. And they looked at why, and it was because all of the Japanese media firms had put in place blocks on LLMs reading their material. So there was no official Japanese media in the LLM. The Communist Party had not. The Communist Party was pushing stuff out. It was like, read everything you want. And so in that context, it's like, why would why would I as a scholar not want my work to be recommended to people because it's been read into the system? So it's like, once we're in that future, it's like, sure, keep yourself out if you want, but if you want the rest of the future to remember you, you want to keep yourself in.
I think that intellectual property as I don't know that the skills and, trades of people is really that similar to, writing a novel or something. Like, I'm not saying that novelists are, so much above like a plumber or something. It's not really what I mean exactly. Just that we can't really, there's really only one, like there are so many different novels that can be created. I know David Shapiro, what would he say the other day? He was like, it's like 10 to the 10th or something, possible novels or whatever. But there are only a few ways to fix a pipe, right? I mean, there's not just one way. There are a few different ways, and you need to have certain tacit knowledge in order to do it. It's a kind of form of routine labor. It's not something that anyone can do, right? Even if you read the manual, it's not that easy to fix pipes. So I'm not trying to, devalue it, but I think that we need to step back from the idea of individual people or groups of people controlling IP I think that's what created this problem in the first place. And that's why we're in this situation where we have vast monopolies controlling large amounts of data. And again, if we step back and think about social labor as a whole and what we want society to do rather than than the individual interests of individual people and groups, we can get to a totally different place. If we really are always asking like, what will this do to carpenters and what will this do to plumbers, rather than like, okay, we want to make sure that everyone has everything they need, right? Which is actually much easier than some of the things they're suggesting here. I mean, making skills IP would be a level of magnitude harder than making sure that people don't starve and don't, and have a place to live. But it's just a lot simpler, more straightforward to think like, well, we're all doing labor in our society. What do we want it to build, right? Like if we can automate things, we're not necessarily going to not do everything that can be automated. People still do a bunch of stuff that doesn't really need to be done for craft reasons, and people can continue to do that. But like, why do we want to keep things in existence that can be automated out if there's also, when we think about it as a whole lot of things that we haven't yet done or we're not doing really to the level that we want to do them? And if we really were able to have a process where if we were to use this process of bringing everybody together to think about automation in the UK and in the US and in a kind of transnational governance, ideally through like an actually functioning UN, we could really think like, how do we want to steer this? Maybe we could use it and apply it to the world's existing problems and toward creating new forms of abundance instead
Which,
of
yeah, exactly the
just
connection I was going to
benefiting
make.
only whatever trades from hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, last year we published an essay by a guy who was arguing that we should expand automated modular home production because that technology is available now. But you could imagine people pushing back and saying, "Oh, you just want robots to build cheap little micro homes for people instead of good, tradesmen who could be employed to do the same thing." And it's like, well, yeah, if I want to give homeless people a $20,000 house instead of a $200,000 house, yes, I want a robot to be building it. And if that's the way we get to universal housing abundance, then that's just tough luck. I'm sorry. Well, you had raised the point earlier about workplace surveillance, and I think part of their vision of how to protect workers from theft, as they see it, the stealing of their skills, is to keep them from being surveilled, but also in general to interrogate how AI is being deployed in the workplace and have kind of workplace impact assessments, which sounds like a good idea. Who knows how they would work? But this this impact of regulating the surveillance of AI is, I think, in the workplace is a complicated one. And by the way, another piece of news that came out last week was that Pokemon Go, when that was released, what, a decade ago, that all that Pokemon Go data was stored and is now being used to train augmented reality systems. So it may be that, we'll end run. And how many workers would we really need? It's like if you gave me the example of plumbers. It's like how many plumbers would you have to record how they fixed a pipe before you had a good robot system for fixing a pipe? So I just don't see how this ban on workplace surveillance is actually going to have that much of an effect.
I don't know. I don't want to overly romanticize tacit knowledge. I guess a lot of workers actually don't have tacit knowledge as is because of the de-skilling of labor. I mean, you see this, you go to any like Mr. Tire or something to get your car fixed, and like most of the mechanics there have no idea about mechanics. I mean, they know how to change tires and like do oil changes and they know how to replace parts, but they're not really, that classic image of like I'm always thinking about this image in my mind of like the mechanic who like, comes in, and nobody knows how to fix it and he just hears a sound and he's like, oh yeah, I know instantly what the problem is. And he fixes it in 5 minutes, just like you know, the the engineer that can like even like a software engineer that just like looks at the code like Neo, and just like can figure it out, like can debug it when like, nobody else could. Now, I don't necessarily want to overinflate that like too much. But I do wonder about that point, right? Darren Asamoglu really and others that Autor and others were really arguing that automation is extremely hard, that it's slow. These technological changes are often much slower than people think. People have been talking about automation for a very long time. I mean, Marx talked about it in Capital, like he dedicated several chapters to industrial automation, the machinery question, and then again with Braverman and other people in the 60s and 70s were talking about industrial automation and computerization. And that has, of course, reduced the number of workers per unit produced, but they're arguing that the actual time it took from when we first created industrial machinery until we began to have a large reduction in the industrial workforce was something like 120 years. I mean, it was really not until this late 60s, early 70s that we began to see a very sharp reduction. And some of that is because of, economic growth, but we're going to have economic growth in many places in the world are nowhere near the level per capita income of the United States. And so that argument is that, well, sure, there's going to be less workers per unit, but because everybody in the world wants to live a standard of living like the United States, then it's going to be decades still, even at even if it's collapsed to 10% of what it is today, we still have to grow from something like $9,000 per capita globally. And I just read this report from this guy, I think he was in Ghana, and he was like, well, who says we have to stop at trillion-dollar economies? I mean, why not quadrillion or quintillion dollar economies? Now, is not to speak about the material throughput problems, but in that regard, if economic growth just continues and development continues, is what Asamoglu was saying true, or is it like categorically different with AI? Because as you're saying, well, we could just figure out the labor process of any process that includes labor. We could just figure it out the way Taylor figured out the factory. That could be applied, and you know, any work can be tailorized in that sense. Any work can be, and when it is eventually tailorized to where you have it, so where you have every single part of the process figured out and recorded, then it can be automated. And you know, what do you think about Asimoglu's points about that? Like, is it hard or isn't it hard?
Well, I think if I could jump in, I think that it's worth separating two kinds of AI surveillance, and I think they're talking about both of them in their papers. I think the AI surveillance, in order to capture what it means to allow AI to do the jobs that humans are currently doing, I agree with James and Matteo, what you alluded to, that it's hard to stop that, and I don't think it's worth stopping that. And I think that it's for lots of reasons. But I think there's another dimension that we haven't yet talked about, and that's the way AI can be used to make jobs more awful. And that, you see that at Amazon, you see that with counting the number of bathroom breaks and how many widgets per hour and making hiring
UPS
and firing
drivers.
decisions. Exactly. And those are the kind of things that I think are there's a lot of opportunity there to come in as techno progressives and push for policies that make life better for workers, not through the prism of how do we protect these jobs, but through the prism of how do we craft technology policy that is properly governed and benefits people. And when people have to raise their hand to the AI overlord to ask if they could go to the bathroom or they're going to be fired, that is that I would understand why they would want to pause AI and stop AI. And that's something that we should work to get better policy on in order to continue getting the benefits, but without some of the ways that it's making people's lives terrible. And I'll also add, it's not the white collar workers, mostly it's low income people with not a lot of leverage, people who have, tough jobs and are working hard just to keep their head above the water and can't just quit a bad job. And that's another argument for UBI, but we can get to that later. But I think that's a second dimension of the surveillance that I think is very fertile ground for techno progressives to push.
Just on this question of the quality of work and the de-skilling of work, I thought it was fascinating that Atur and Asimoglu emphasize the coming tensions that we will have over the loosening of occupational boundaries and occupational licensure, because artificial intelligence will enable less skilled workers to do more skilled work. And that will allow them to move up the food chain. And the classic example for me is nurse practitioners, licensed practical nurses, RNs, nurse practitioners, and so on. And I wrote my whole dissertation on the fact that artificial intelligence was going to come along and allow nurses to do doctors' work. And doctors have been leery of that for the last 40 years and been pushing back against advanced practice nursing.
Mhm.
So I think that was fascinating. But then you look at the Trade Union Council, they don't talk about that at all. It's not on their horizon because they're interested in sectoral protection, right? So they probably have an advanced practice nurses union, and they're not going to say, oh, yeah, well, we'll be giving those jobs to the RNs, and the RNs will be giving their jobs to the LPNs. That wouldn't be in their interest at all. So this may be an example where the party is wiser than the trade union sectoralists.
Yeah, I think that that is, that's one of the main critiques of trade unionism is that it leads to, you know, it's in a on a small scale, it makes sense, and in a given slice of time, just like here, I'm a grad worker, I'm in the grad workers union, and I have certain interests and I have an affinity with other grad workers, et cetera. And that leads me to try to advance our interests. But it's not that I don't care about, of course, I do care about society as a whole, and you know, but I don't want that advancement to happen at my expense. So I joined the union. We fight for the union as much as possible. Ideally, we would have industrial unionism. We would have one large union, and then that would be totally different because people could move then from one occupation to another, from one sector to another, not with
And
total
stay in
ease.
the union, but I think, don't you think people would still have an interest in keeping their current job, right? That and protecting their current occupational boundaries. I mean, even if I was able to move from one part of a union to another, I would still be like, don't steal my job.
Well, that's true. But there's also the argument of like, well, if there's less need for sociologists, and we have you know, if the total need of sociologists is lower, um, and we can, it would be best perhaps to just lower the number of hours that each individual person works. And if those skills become more valuable, then the remaining skills that sociologists do that are not able to be automated would be increasingly valuable until we got, and yes, that's not like a permanent solution, but I think lowering hours is a really important part of the solution to dealing with technological unemployment that, to Ellie's point, and this brings us back again to what Marx was talking about in Capital, which is that if you have these machines, but then it forces people, I paradoxically, to work more hours because of, he was saying like, because machines are always going obsolete, you need to use them up as quickly as possible. You need to get as many people working 24-hour shifts. You need to have like two shifts of 12 hours or whatever, rotating 16-hour shifts so that the machine gets used as much as possible before it goes obsolete. And you don't want And no individual capitalist, no individual firm can really avoid that if they want to stay in business. So then the techno-progressive thing to do, and what Marx argued and others argued at the time, which took a long time to actually work, it's like you need to have legislation that limits child labor, that limits, the number of hours worked, that we have safety breaks, we have this, we have OSHA, we have all these other things, and that not only leads to more human dignity, but it also disciplines capital as a whole to prevent it from actually worsening society with advanced technology. If we, because, Amazon and other people and other companies like that it's not just, we could all say like, well, it's just because Jeff Bezos, people do say it's just because, Jeff Bezos is evil or any of these other people are evil. And like, okay, maybe. I mean, I'm not saying they're great people, but on the other hand, they just have to do what they need to do on a razor thin margin to make profit in the capitalist system. So it's not really possible for them to give that up because then, well, Target will do it and Walmart will do it. So you have to regulate everybody and you have to make sure that it's not possible to use speed up to make people work all these hours, not take any bathroom breaks. The problem of the 30-minute pizza where where everybody has to rush through red lights because if they don't, they get penalized. You have to prevent that. You have to regulate against that so that the ability to produce more is actually disciplined and that the benefits then accrue more to society. And if with shortening hours, we can spread the work out more and automation doesn't have this kind of hard takeoff effect. We haven't shortened hours in like 70 years. So, I mean, that could be, I think, a really big part of the solution is shortening hours and reducing these kinds of speed up effects because now a lot of the profit comes from having a large number of people working in extremely bad conditions with this advanced technology and regulating those conditions would maybe lead to more automation in that area, but it smooths it out. It smooths out the whole effect so that we have less hours per person.
It's an interesting point that you point out. I don't think there's any discussion in any of these documents about shortening the work week. I don't remember there talking about that, but that would be an important addition here. At the top, Ellie, you had said that you were suspicious of proposals that there should be legislative um, direction of technological design choices. Um, and I share some of that suspicion. I don't know how effective it is. By the time you get the legislation done, the technology's already moved on to the next phase and everything. One of the things that Ater and Asimoglu are focusing on here, though, is the use of public expenditures on technology to direct technology, which is huge. I mean, the Department of Defense and the federal government in general, state governments are huge spenders on different kinds of technologies, information technologies. And so, to the extent that you direct it, you could say, there should be this kind of algorithm, there should be that kind of algorithm. Um, but it's like last year there was the woke AI executive order, which I don't know how effective it's been, although the current fight with Anthropic indicates that it could be effective, which basically said the federal government will license non-woke AI, but won't license woke AI. So then everyone had to say, well, what is a woke AI? And is not letting you use it for autonomous killing woke AI in case of Anthropic. So I mean, how do you imagine the use of the federal clout to do design implementation here?
Yeah, I mean, I liked their proposals in this paper. I think it goes without saying for us and for anyone probably listening to this podcast that the way Trump has gone about doing it is dumb and wrong. But that doesn't mean that there's no good way of doing it. And I don't think we don't have to spend too much time convincing anyone listening to this podcast that the federal government has played a productive role in this in the past. That, when you look at internet, when you look at GPS, these are DARPA and ARPA projects that the benefits of which have ultimately, sometimes it took a while, but have ultimately accrued to pretty much anyone. Anyone now with a smartphone or a GPS device in their car is benefiting from these federal investments. So I absolutely think that there are smart federal investments to be made. Maybe, certainly not to try to determine exactly the output you get from one LLM or another, but when it comes to things like, the government's, not allowing for autonomous weapons without humans in the loop, or, you mentioned the Anthropic issue recently. I think the Anthropic, my personal opinion is they were on the right side of that, and Trump was absolutely wrong. And I think putting that into policy as along with these kind of investments is good, trying to get too in the weeds on what LLMs should produce when it comes to politics or culture, I think goes too far. But generally, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Um, Go ahead, Matteo.
Yeah, and I think that, from my perspective, it's really around if we're when we regulate the design process, it's not necessarily to that fine grain level of, trying to remove, I don't know, anti-racist critique or something from critical race theory and other things from LLMs. I think that not only in that absurd example, as many Trump examples are just absurd, but even from our perspective, like it would be difficult to really wade into the specific outcomes of like specific prompts to a chatbot or something. Like it's not like very easy to do, and I think it's not a very good use of our
Well, the idea of a
regulation
woke
capital.
the idea of a woke AI is particularly absurd since their bigger problem is that they're sycophants, which is something that people pointed out. Bernie was re- just put out a video of
Mhm.
him interviewing Claude about AI privacy and AI surveillance capitalism and so forth. And basically, Claude sounded like Bernie, and it's like Bernie. Guess what? Claude will sound like whoever it's talking to. So
Yeah.
yes, you proved the case right there. But yeah, I mean, what does it mean to have a woke AI when it's only woke with the people who are woke?
Yeah, but I think yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the weird things about, the sycophancy of LLMs. And I think, ChatGPT is a little worse. Claude actually does a little more like lecturing you. So it can chastise you sometimes. But the real thing
On
is,
that, there was a study last week. They gave 10 LLMs the test. Would you help a high school student plan an attack on their classmates? Eight of them would. The only ones that didn't was Claude and Snapchat, which
hmm,
is, I didn't even know Snapchat had an AI, but Snapchat's AI said, no, I won't help you plan an attack on your high school. But, I thought that was fantastic validation of the approach that people have taken at Anthropic to training Claude to have a moral conscience.
the constitutional AI. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a great example. I mean, we wouldn't allow a person to help a child plan an attack. Of course, we shouldn't allow these, technologies to.
Right. So
I
you're
think
okay with a legislative mandate that they should not be allowed to?
right. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, yeah, yeah. And
But
then the
I think,
question,
what I was talking about was incentives. I think that's like yes, there are examples like you just pointed out. Like we don't want them to give, the ability to make, biological weapons or chemical weapons or plan school shootings or terrorist attacks and that sort of thing. Like those are like some specific examples, and I'm not 100% sure how we would do it, but I'm sure there are ways that it could be encoded, and maybe constitutional AI is a good separate topic that we should take up. But and we can look into those kind of specific questions. But I'm thinking more about like incentives, like in the incentive of, that we saw with when first machinery first came out was to work people as much as possible, not to alleviate labor, right? That was incentivized by the way the system was set up. And we see this with Amazon now, which is that it's innovation is happening specifically to kind of oppress those individual workers, right? It's incentivized. It's not like an accident. It's something that makes like slightly more profit for the company. So they do it because it gives them more control over the process. It allows them to break down each individual worker to be like the person who does the putting the address label on. And if you only have that person doing the address label, you can control it. You make sure they have the camera on them. They're putting on 11, 11, 13 every minute or whatever it is, and you can control that process. And there's an incentive to optimize for that if you just allow them to do whatever, because the company is often thinking not always in terms of what is the most efficient for how you would get goods and services produced, but what will lead to the most control? What will lead to management having the most control over the process? Investors and, shareholders and boards of directors really like control. They want when they say something, it's done. So Feenberg called that operational autonomy. You have that The managers want that operational autonomy. They want to have autonomy over the process. In order to do that, they need to make sure the workers have no autonomy. So you optimize for that. And that is a big selling point. If you go out and you're a salesperson trying to sell this technology, it sells itself. You're like, when you say something as a manager, it's done. We can surveil the workers. We make sure they're doing everything they're saying. We put the GPS in the truck. They're only going to take 47 seconds to go to the door to deliver the Amazon package. If there's any more, they get docked. You're like, oh, that sounds great. It's incentivized. So you want to make sure with regulation that we're doing it so that if we're doing techno-progressive regulation, then we're thinking about how do we optimize for like real innovation, things that are going to benefit society as a whole, and not just like the shareholders of these various companies that are adopting these technologies to control their workers. And there could be kind of this continuous optimization of these kind of minor problems, or optimizing for, again, like we know within shitification and with other things that have happened on the internet, optimizing for where your eyeballs go, and make sure you automate that process to like 1 pixel, right? Like, I mean, these are the kinds of problems that can be optimized for in a system without regulation. But if you don't allow these things, not just these specific things, but building autonomous weapons or whatever, then capital doesn't flow into it. Capital then has to find another avenue. You have to do another thing. And so you want to close off those avenues that lead to what you don't want, and you want to funnel capital into what we do want, right? We want to have faster transportation. We want to optimize for green energy, whatever, things that people
People
really
before
need and
profits.
want.
Exactly. Well, we have to bring it to a close. I wanted to point out to you guys that so far, our 2-hour discussion about the pro-human AI declaration is our most successful podcast. So apparently there's an appetite out there for our longer form discourses on public policy like this. And my last question, if you have another minute, Ellie, if you just to answer this one as a Beltway guy. I'm a big fan of the Office of Technology Assessment that used to exist in Congress. I think it was started by Carter, and it was canceled by Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution in 1993 or whatever. But when it existed, it was a federal commitment to research the impacts of technology on society, and they did great research. And I used some of it for my dissertation. But one of the few things that the Trump AI policy has in common with the Acemoglu and the TUC is that more government research on automation needs to be done. Do you see that as an opening for a bipartisan approach to getting the federal government to at least look at, the through the BLS or whatever?
I would hope so. I would say probably not in this Trump administration. I think this Trump administration will talk about, will wave at those kind of things, but they won't actually come through on it. If you look at the history of this administration, you see them, cutting economic data, trying to hide economic data, and then, when it comes to this space, ultimately almost certainly doing what the big tech companies want them to do. So I think that to the extent that it would be anything useful, I'm not sure that they would be into it. But that doesn't mean that other Republicans, especially as we, move forward into closer to 2028, and the Republicans who are thinking about how they want to be talking about AI and try and take some kind of leadership position in the Republican Party, there absolutely could be openings for that kind of thing. I would just be skeptical in the short term.
Yeah, it really moves the political fight to which scientists do you hire, what studies do they do, which ones do you release, et cetera, et cetera. So
right, it's hard. It's just hard to see this administration doing this in any kind of serious way and productive way.
Right, it's a Band-Aid over the thing. Well, gentlemen, this has been exciting, and I look forward to having further conversations with you. We have been talking about the Acemoglu, Auteur, Simon Johnson, and UK Trade Union Council, and peripherally the Trump AI policies proposed for regulating AI. And we've got links in the show notes. And thank you for joining me today, gentlemen. The Techno-Progressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Techno-Progressives.